you were just, in theory, labelling some high status parts of the manor. The manor is the overlap between this week's starting theme of rural settlement and when we last had classes face to face, when we were talking about agriculture and landscapes. So if we're starting with rural settlement, as we are this week, and then moving on to urban settlement, the manor is a good starting place for us because it has both high status housing and low status housing. In particular, one of the things that was on that idealized manor plan that you were just hopefully labelling, we'll see if it works, was the manor house. So how do we identify the manor house? You might think it would be straightforward, but actually preservation is an issue here because a lot of manor houses were, like any other type of housing at the time, constructed of organic materials. And so identifying what is the manor house can be actually pretty problematic. We might look for size. We might look for a big building, but we might also look for deeper foundations. If we have any remnants of building materials, we would expect to find better quality building materials associated with high status housing. Another thing we might hope to find is what we call an undercroft, and this is basically a cellar within the main room at the ground floor level. Of course, though, and I need to say to you guys, since you know that not every building can have a basement attached to it. So identifying a basement is only going to work some of the times. If it's a large building, we might look for pillars or other engineering structures to support the size of it. However, in saying that, that's still very oversimplified. There are other large buildings that need to be constructed in the Middle Ages, not just the manor house where the lord lives. The other thing we might find, and in fact the evidence suggests, that there may be multiple separate buildings associated with the manor house, and of which only one of them would be what we might have the functions we would expect to find in a house. That is the private accommodation for the lord and his immediate family. If we're dealing with multiple buildings, it's actually probably going to be quite a small one. The limited evidence we've got suggesting for that. Instead, the largest building on the site might be a attached or unattached timber hall. Usually the halls were made out of timber, though I have come across some stone examples. And adjoining the timber hall might be a service wing for supporting functions for the hall, like a pantry or bakehouse or a brew house. The hall, no matter, and when we talk about housing culture soon, the hall is the most important part of a higher status domestic space in the Middle Ages. It's really the multifunctional public-private interfacing room. Many things could take place here, from feasting, very important part of lordly identity in the Middle Ages, to where the local manor courts would be held, to where the peasants would go to talk to the lord, to pay their rent. So really, to a medieval person, the hall was the central part of any domestic building. Kitchens were likely to be separate yet again, and this is a very common sense response because if we're dealing with predominantly wood buildings, fire is a constant hazard. And of course, the kitchen is going to be the most hazardous place of all. So if we are looking for like a building complex, other things we might look for to indicate that it is a lordly complex might be like dovecots. The dovecot is going to be, past tense. I'm always telling you guys use past tense, and here I am flittering into present tense. The dovecot would have been located close to the manor house. We have documentary evidence suggesting that in many cases a dovecot was built even before the manor house was put up because it was such an accepted built emblem of lordliness. So they would have had that very close to the main building. So if you find a dovecot, then it indicates it's probably the centre of the manor. Stables, another thing we might hope to find, because remember that when we're talking about agriculture, it's mainly oxen that the peasants were using for the ploughs, not horses. Also other administrative buildings. And these might be set around a courtyard. That makes sense if we're dealing with lots of buildings serving separate functions, that they will be arranged in an easy, accessible and quite defined way. So that means that it might end up being a castle, but even our evidence suggests that castles had a castle complex around them. Or it might be a completely undefended house and other buildings, or it might be somewhere in between. The somewhere in between being a moated site. So that's what the picture here on the right is. Depending on the size of the moated site, it could be a large central house with a simple moat around it or ditch, or it could be this aforementioned courtyard with a moat or ditch surrounding it. And this one on the right here is pretty small. You've got some shrubs there for the size of scale. All right, though, but this is high status. What about vernacular housing? And I'm sure for those of you who've taken lots of HP classes, you know exactly what I mean by vernacular housing. I mean everyday housing. How do we find that? Well, we might look for something called burgage plots. And the burgage plots is a combination of the house and then the outbuildings that would have stood on the plot. The outbuildings being the long thin plot at the back called the tuft. Sorry, the tuft is where the house is going to be, and the long rectilinear private area at the rear being called the croft. So burgage plot or croft and tuft. And these are features of both settlements in the countryside, that is rural settlements, and also urban settlements. We might hope to find house platforms, but not necessarily. But we might hope to find those, and that would identify if they were no longer standing. We debate a lot as to what peasant housing looked like, particularly since most of what evidence we have got for where peasants lived came from nucleated settlement rather than dispersed or isolated housing. Now, an example of nucleated settlement that survives just at the subsurface level is here a picture on the right. So this is rural. So, I mean, you can have a nucleated settlement and still be rural. Nucleated just means that it's sort of concentrated around something, whether it's a church or a manor house or a marketplace even, whereas a dispersed housing might be a family homestead or a hamlet of only a few houses clustered around, or even just an isolated farmhouse. So there's a bit of a commonality between rural nucleated settlement and urban settlement there. So we might look for what we call deserted medieval villages, and we abbreviate them to DMV. So if you do DMV, it does not mean medieval people are going to get their driver's licenses. It means they're deserted medieval villages. Some very famous ones are from Warren Percy in England. That's where the picture on the right here comes from. And then in Ireland, our best studied one is Newtown Jerpoint. At Newtown Jerpoint, what kind of vernacular housing we've got are large, rectangular, mud-walled housing with two rooms, but there's also not just mud-walled, there's also stone-built structures, and these might have been 2 stories in height. Were they a dwelling, were they a barn, or were they multi-purpose? There's been suggested based on Newtown Jerpoint that size is what indicates status, not necessarily building materials. The hall is present even in vernacular housing. So as long as it was a typical larger house, the hall would have been in the open space for multifunctional use at the ground floor. You could have slept in the hall, or maybe you had separate bedding areas. Storage would have been above the hall as well. At Warren Percy, they have evidence for a very typical medieval building called the Longhouse, which, as the name suggests, is a long rectangular house, but they would have had a central hearth. So the hearth would have been central even within the hall. Within larger medieval rural houses, we usually say that there's 3 components to it. The hall, which is our principal living room, and that would have been very central in terms of space. There would have been a service end at one side of the hall, or in the longhouse. This might have been an area occupied by livestock, but also could have been converted to domestic use. It would have been divided from the hall by a cross passage or just even a doorway. And at the other end of the hall, the opposite side, or even up above, if there was multiple stories, the more private rooms. The whole part, we know, would have been single-storied, even if the bits at the end might have had multiple stories. There's a very simple reason for why the hall would have been single-storied. It also would have been open to the roof. No glazed windows, everything would have been unglazed, and the reason for that is the central hearth. They'd need somehow to let all the smoke out. But both ends could be storied, and then you could have had separate upper rooms accessed by stairs or even as simple as ladders. Because the roof above where the hearth was in the central hall was open and the smoke would rise, this part of the building, we believe, probably would have been one of the most elaborate parts because it would have been the most public part. It would have been the most visible part. Otherwise, probably really by modern day standards, very plain interiors. Wealthier families might have enjoyed more specialised rooms, like a second parlour. They might have had even their own private chapel or a separate kitchen. But they often tend to be really quite linear in terms of their plan. This type of stereotypical house, we call it tripartite, 3 parts, tended to share a single roof, unlike our lordly houses. But you might have had maybe C-shaped or different shapes at the ends, but certainly the hall would have been central. Earlier versions of this sort of zenith would have been smaller, might have been contained a byre for the animals, but certainly you could have had smaller buildings on your croft for barns or places to keep your animals. Floors tended to be made of clay. This meant that they could be often replaced easily and not too expensively. Only the very best homes would have had tiles. Indeed, in Ireland, I know that most of the places that we find tiles are actually from high status, very wealthy monasteries. Not even high status houses would have had tiles. Instead, to cover your clay floor, you would have had a woven mat. We might even be able to see where the furniture had been. Because the furniture would have been very utilitarian, made out of wood. So, for example, benches rather than, light chairs. They needed sturdy furniture. And if you plunked a bench down somewhere, you might not have been moving it too often, and so you'll find less wear under the benches. The element that tends to be emphasised in medieval housing, both vernacular and high status, and this is again open to debate, is public. Certainly the way of housing was a lot more public than what we're used to today, mainly because they focused on large rooms, central rooms with multiple social functions. Servants would have lived in and slept in the same spaces as their lords. It's only when we hit the 14th century that we have the increased trend to privacy with separate rooms and differentiated functions. And by the 17th century, the hall has completely disappeared and instead has been replaced by the kitchen. Now, most of these buildings, both lower and higher status, would have been made out of timber. So the majority of vernacular housing in the Middle Ages would have been used timber construction. They're almost prefabricated in a way. We know that they tended to fell the trees and then put it up within a year. The reason for this is that they wanted to use green wood. Green wood would have been easier to work with their tools and implements, a lot easier to hack and saw through than mature and seasoned wood. However, there comes the risk of the wood warping. We think that had this, they would have been building it out of green wood, it would have warped, and if it stayed upright after 5 years, then it could potentially stand upright for many, many centuries. The accounts that we have of building collapse in the Middle Ages tend to be very soon after construction, and the implication is that they didn't know what way the green wood was going to warp, and so it led to it going the wrong way and collapsing. It's estimated here that although timber buildings were built in both rural and urban scenarios, probably up to 60% of the urban examples were shops, in that the ground floor, or what you guys would call the first floor, was a shop front, and then the domestic functions would have taken place above. So these examples that I've got here are all from Suffolk and England, and they actually are all showing this shop front. To us, we might not be, we think about going into a store to go shopping, but in reality, in the Middle Ages, what we're looking for is a very, very large window that would have operated like as a hatch almost, and you would have done your shopping through this hatch. So, here's one here. Here's another one right here with modern window inserted, obviously. How do we tell about status? Well, we don't know for sure. One of the things that's been suggested is that you used more timber the wealthier you were, because good quality building timber was very, very expensive no matter where you were. And as we know, the Middle Ages is a period of deforestation. So it's been suggested that the higher status, the more wood. Indeed, when we read accounts of castles in the Middle Ages, today we tend to think of the big elaborate stone castles being the awe-inspiring one, but from contemporary accounts, it seems that they don't really differentiate between stone and timber that much. We have people visiting timber castles and being completely awed by how much wood there was. So it might be more timber indicated increased wealth. Again, we might presume that urban examples had more timber involved and that rural examples were more plain, because we're dealing with a very public-facing society, and in a rural area, there's simply fewer people to impress. Now, the roof would have been thatched in these examples originally. Here you can see that they've got shingles, but likely even the urban examples would have had a thatched roof. Now, these ones that we're looking at are pretty wealthy, even if they are vernacular. The lowest status houses would have been single-roomed cottages and what we might just call hovels even. Those are even harder to identify, because even if there's any post hole surviving, they're so small, they're so plain, it's very hard to ascribe function. In terms of the method of construction, the most common methods were either called crock construction or box framed. Crock refers to the roofing arrangement. If you can imagine like a wishbone shaped, that would be a crock, so like multiple wishbone shaped, and the sort of like the bit that carries all the strength is up in the roof, up in the very top where the two parts meet each other. And because this is where the pressure would have been applied, it meant that the walls could have been thinner. Although we still know them archaeologically, because we'll find good big post holes, and they always would be very regularly spaced to support the whole building. Box framed, these ones here look to be much more box framed. I don't think I've got an example here of crock built. Are, as the name suggests, they have a frame, a box shape with a frame, and so they're kind of, a box. And then you put everything that you want on the inside. The walls carry the weight. So, taking this to rural settlement then, we focus mainly on the manor, but that is not to say that it's always going to be a manor. In Western Europe, yes, we might presume that the focal point of rural settlement is going to be the manor. That means that there's going to be a house, manor house there, a parish church, and a village. And the village would house the peasants paying the rent. But not necessarily. There's plenty of exceptions to this rule. For example, rural settlement might be what we call transhumant. And that means that it is kind of nomadic, I suppose the best way to describe it. In Eastern Europe, this was certainly the case, we think possibly in some parts of Ireland too. So this would mean temporary settlements. In Eastern Europe, this is a period of agricultural expansion. So they were conducting slash and burn agriculture. They were what we call asarding. They were bringing more land under cultivation, so it made sense to be transhumant. That is, build your settlement as you went. So as you expand your area of agriculture, you move your housing along with it. Transhumance is also very well suited for mountainous or more marginal regions. For example, In Ireland, the reason we think we might have transhumans is if you lived in a more mountainous region and you were predominantly engaged in pastoral agriculture, particularly cattle grazing. You would move twice a year to accompany your cattle to your summer grazing area and then to your winter grazing area, and therefore you would have two settlements that you would move back and forth between. Now, even apart from this, most rural settlement would have been nucleated. So that means a village, which could be up to around 300 people, or a hamlet, and a hamlet would have maybe a minimum of 3 families. There would, of course, be isolated farmhouses, but except in more marginal regions, this was not usually the norm that we think. Of course, most rural settlement would have been very focused on agriculture. But as we discussed in an earlier class, this is not necessarily the only thing peasants did. We also have mining villages, fishing villages, or even a combination of different occupations. A lot of medieval villages were very planned. A lord might decide he's going to found a village or relocate a village, and so he might set it around a central place. Oftentimes this might be a central green or around a marketplace to promote a market economy. In Irish plantation villages, the typical shape was usually a triangle. This was their multi-purpose space. We can often see if it was a planned village when we see nice regular crofts and tofts. Then we know that it has been deliberately set out and not haphazardly put together. We often find planned settlements with colonisation. A lord is finding an entirely new settlement in a new place that he's just got hold of, and he might recruit tenants from his estates elsewhere and attract them by being like, come to my lovely planned community, you will have a lovely predefined croft and toft, and you will have your own space and you won't need to be living on top of your neighbours. Now, this is, again, generalizations. In places like Spain and Italy, we often are able to support rural settlement and spot it because they often were fortified villages. In what way we might be looking to see a village version of a castle in Spain and Italy. So these might be up high, but there would have been a lot of emphasis on the surrounding walls. In the Byzantine Empire, we're looking for peasants who don't really own very much outright. Instead, they rent their land, and they could often pay very high rents. Oftentimes in the Byzantine Empire, we're looking for their fields, and their fields are square types, and there was a social distinction with those who could own animals. So it can be very hard in the Byzantine Empire to identify. Another form that's very hard to identify is early medieval rural settlement. Everything that I've talked to you about today is pretty much either high or late medieval that survives. We have very, very little across Europe surviving from the early Middle Ages. Again, we're back to the issue of impermanent materials. Agricultural settlements are much easier to identify than transhuman settlements because if you're not moving house on a regular basis, you're free to invest more in it. We used to think that there was more transhumans taking place in the early Middle Ages because this was a time of agricultural expansion and a period of migration too. I'm going to stop my video here on rural settlement. The next clip for you to watch comes from the Terry Jones Medieval Lives, The Peasant. It's only 3 minutes to watch, but this is like a recreation video of peasant housing. So just to bring some life to what I was just telling you about the layout of these medieval houses. Now the video on the next slide should start at 10 minutes 30 seconds. If it doesn't, you should start it at 10 minutes 30 seconds, and you only need to watch it for 3 minutes, up until about 13 minutes and 30 seconds.